My family abandoned me at the hospital, and I overheard the conversation I was never supposed to hear, and every word rewrote the story I told myself about my own life. The admission began as something routine, one more episode of my stubborn blood pressure, one more night under observation at the municipal hospital. My children brought me in with the same efficiency with which they took the car for regular maintenance. They left me in the emergency room with promises to come back the next morning, their goodbye kisses as quick as signatures on important documents. The first night passed in the bluish half-light of the hospital corridors. The sounds were familiar, the constant beeping of monitors, the squeak of the medication cart's wheels, the whispers of the nurses on the night shift. I slept in short bursts, waking every hour expecting to see one of them. Michael with his newspaper under his arm. Sarah with her tense smile, sitting in the plastic chair beside my bed. Morning came with no visits. Breakfast arrived on a foam tray, with a poached egg and rubbery bread. The hours dragged by, marked only by the nurses changing shifts and the way the sunlight shifted in the room's window. My cell phone remained silent on the bedside table, its dark screen a mute testimony to the fact that I had been forgotten. In the afternoon, I was moved to a semi-private room. My new roommate was an elderly woman with a fractured femur, whose family took turns visiting her. I watched her grandchildren bring colorful drawings, her daughters adjust her pillow, her husband read the newspaper aloud. Every small gesture of care from them was a reminder of my own loneliness. On the second day, reality began to press in. The nurses avoided my eyes when I asked about phone calls. The cleaning staff hurried past my room as if my condition were contagious. Even the doctor, during his rounds, spoke to me in the tone reserved for patients without family, professional, distant, almost clinical. It was on the night of the third day that it happened. The pain medication had left me in a state of semi-consciousness, my body heavy as lead, my mind floating between sleep and wakefulness. The room was dark, except for the faint light from the corridor that slipped through the crack of the half-open door. I heard familiar voices outside. Michael and Sarah, whispering with an urgency that made my heart race even through the chemical days. At first, I felt relief. They had come, finally. But then the words began to arrange themselves into sentences, and the sentences into meanings I was not prepared to understand. We cannot keep going like this, Sarah's voice said, tense as an overstrained wire. And what do you suggest? Take her home? Are you going to take care of her? Michael's voice was rough, impatient. The silence that followed said more than any sentence. I heard the sound of someone leaning against the wall, a deep sigh that carried the weight of impossible decisions. And then came the words that would change everything. They were not about care or concern. They were about numbers, about costs, about the emotional price of keeping a mother who no longer fit into the life her children had built. Every syllable was like a small death. Not a knife, something more insidious, like water seeping through the cracks of a foundation I had always believed was solid. The walls of my reality began to crumble in slow motion, brick by brick, while I listened to the true story of my own life being told in a hospital corridor. In that moment, lying in a hospital bed with my eyes closed and my heart shattered, I understood that some conversations are not meant for our ears, not because they are secrets, but because they carry truths that we are too fragile to bear. What began as a simple nap between exams became the moment when I heard the truth my family had tried to hide behind forced smiles. The conversation in the corridor ended as abruptly as it had begun. I heard my children's footsteps moving away, their whispers fading into the distance like echoes of a nightmare from which I could not wake. I stayed still in the bed, my body still heavy from the medication, but my mind now completely alert, as if someone had thrown a bucket of ice-cold water over my soul. The first moments were pure denial. Maybe I had dreamed it, maybe the combination of medications had created auditory hallucinations. But the words were carved into my memory with cruel clarity, every pause, every intonation, every breath heavy with meaning. There was no way to deny the reality of what I had heard. The night dragged on in slow motion. Every sound in the hospital, the medication cart, the nurses talking, even my roommate's labored breathing, felt amplified, as if the universe were trying to distract me from the truth I now carried. My heart beat in an irregular rhythm, not because of any cardiac issue, but from the emotional shock reverberating through my entire body. I began to mentally revisit the last months, the last years, searching for signs I had ignored. The visits that became more and more sporadic, the conversations that avoided certain subjects, the always ready excuses for not including me in family events. Everything fit together now like pieces of a puzzle I had refused to assemble. Morning arrived with its relentless routine. The day shift nurse came in with my coffee, her face lit by a professional smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Clara. Did you sleep well?" Her habitual question sounded like a bad joke. How could anyone sleep well after discovering that she was a burden to her own family? While she adjusted the intravenous drip, I watched her careful movements, her attention to detail. She checked my vital signs, adjusted the bed, wrote notes in my chart. She cared for me with a dedication my own children no longer seemed able to show. The irony was so bitter that I could almost taste it. My eyes moved around the room, seeing everything from a new angle. The flowers that a friend had brought 2 days earlier now looked like a silent testimony to my shrinking support network. The silent cell phone on the bedside table stood like a monument to my growing irrelevance. Even the photo of my grandchildren, which I kept beside the bed, seemed to accuse me with their innocent smiles. I remembered when my children were little, how I took them to the doctor with an anxiety that bordered on panic. Every fever, every scrape, every earache was treated like a national emergency. I spent sleepless nights beside their beds, checking their breathing, offering drinks, singing lullabies. The love I felt for them was physical, visceral, like an extension of my own body. And now, decades later, I was the sick child, and they were the busy adults with no time to care. The cycle of life, which should have been poetic and natural, revealed itself as brutal and merciless. During the doctor's visit, I kept a deliberate silence. I answered his questions with short words, avoided his eyes, pretended to be weaker than I really was. Inside me, a storm was gathering, anger, sadness, betrayal, but above all, a loneliness so deep it seemed bottomless. The afternoon brought an unexpected visit, my daughter-in-law, Elena, carrying a bag with clean clothes and some snacks. Her face was tense, her movements hurried. She stayed only 15 minutes, talking about work, about the children, about everything except the elephant in the room, the fact that I had been in the hospital for 3 days and no one in the family had come for a proper visit. While she spoke, I noticed her eyes avoiding mine, her restless hands arranging things that did not need arranging. She knew. Of course she knew. Everyone knew, except me. I was the last to find out that I had become a problem to be solved, not a person to be loved. when she left, promising to return the next day with the children. I felt a mix of relief and despair. Relief at not having to keep up the pretense any longer, despair at knowing that the pretense existed. The rest of the day passed in a fog of obsessive thoughts. I replayed every moment of the overheard conversation, analyzed every word, every tone. Michael talked about costs. Sarah about exhaustion, both about the emotional weight of having a mother who was aging in an inconvenient way. In the middle of all that pain, a small spark of clarity began to emerge. If I was a burden, if my existence caused so much suffering, then perhaps the solution was not to continue being the problem, but to find a way to stop being one. It was not about dying, that option never even crossed my mind. It was about living differently, about finding a place in the world where my presence would not be felt as a weight. It was about redesigning my life so that I would no longer need to depend on the conditional love of people who had forgotten how to love unconditionally. And in that instant, lying in the hospital bed with twilight painting the sky orange and purple, Clara Santos began to plan her own escape. Faced with a truth that could destroy what little remained of my family, I had to choose between the silence that protects and the confrontation that sets us free. The night after Elena's visit was the longest of my life. Lying in the darkness of the hospital room, I felt the weight of my decision piling up on my chest like wet stones. Every beat of my heart seemed to echo the same question: what would I do with the knowledge I now carried? In the morning, as the sun rose shyly behind the buildings visible from the window, I watched the other patients in the corridor during my supervised walk. There were men and women of all ages, each carrying their own pain, their own secrets, their own unspoken truths. Some were visited by large families, others, like me, faced their solitude with a dignity that hurt to witness. I went back to my room and sat in the chair beside the bed, my hands trembling not from physical weakness, but from the emotional weight of the choice that approached. I looked at my hands, bulging veins, thin skin, age spots that told the story of 68 years. These hands had cradled babies, prepared family meals, caressed beloved faces. Now they trembled at the thought of using knowledge as a weapon or as a tool for healing. The choice was not simple. On one side was protective silence, swallowing the truth, pretending nothing had happened, continuing to be the mother and grandmother everyone expected me to be. There was a certain comfort in that option, the comfort of familiarity, of maintaining the status quo, of preserving appearances that held up our fragile family structure. On the other side was liberating confrontation, revealing what I knew, forcing an honest conversation, demanding that we face together the difficult truths that had pushed us apart. The price would be high: conflict, possible rupture, the definitive loss of the illusion of a united family. My mind drifted back to the years when I myself was the matriarch, the decision maker, the problem solver. I remembered when Michael, at 7 years old, broke his grandmother's favorite vase, and I taught him that honesty, even when painful, is always better than a comfortable lie. I remembered when teenage Sarah lied about where she was, and I made her face the consequences of her choices. The irony hit me with full force. Here I was, decades later, facing the same lesson I had preached so often to my children. Theory had become reality, and reality was far more frightening than any moral rule I had ever taught. I picked up a notepad that a kind nurse had given me, simple sheets of lined paper that smelled like hospital. The pen trembled in my hand, not because of illness, but because of the magnitude of what I was about to do. The first words came out hesitant, as if they were testing the ground of my own courage. I wrote about love, not the romantic love of movies, but the practical, everyday love that appears in small, consistent gestures. I wrote about family, not the idealized family of photo albums, but the real family, imperfect, full of flaws and contradictions. As the words flowed, something inside me began to change. The quiet anger that had been fermenting since the night of the conversation turned into a deep sadness, but also into a surprising clarity. I realized it was no longer about Michael and Sarah, or even about me. It was about breaking a cycle, the cycle of silence that creates resentment, which in turn creates more silence. I wrote about fear, their fear of seeing me vulnerable, my fear of becoming dependent, our shared fear of aging and mortality. I wrote about how that unspoken fear had pushed us apart more than any illness or outside circumstance ever could. When I finished, there were 4 pages written in my shaky but determined handwriting. It was not a letter of accusation or self-pity. It was an invitation. An invitation to talk about difficult things, about unspoken fears, about unmet expectations. I folded the pages carefully and placed them into an envelope I got from the receptionist. I did not address it to anyone in particular. It would be a message to my family, but also to myself. A record that, even in the middle of pain and abandonment, there was still room for authenticity. When I placed the envelope on the bedside table, I felt a strange mix of terror and release. The terror was real. I knew this decision could mark the end of the family as I knew it. But the release was deeper. It was the feeling of having regained, even if only for a moment, control over my own story. In that moment, looking at the simple envelope that contained my desperate attempt at reconnection, I understood that the real choice had never been between silence and confrontation. The real choice was between continuing to live a comfortable lie or risking everything for a truth that could finally set us free. And Clara Santos had chosen freedom. My choice placed me in the eye of a family storm where every word was a weapon and every silence an accusation. The letter was delivered the next morning. I asked the youngest nurse, the one who still had a spark of compassion in her eyes, to give it to Michael when he came to visit me. She hesitated for a moment, feeling the emotional weight of the envelope in her hands, but finally agreed with a silent nod. The hours that followed were almost unbearable. Every sound of footsteps in the corridor made my heart race. Every voice nearing the room's door left my hands sweaty and my breathing shallow. My roommate, sensing my agitation, tried to start small conversations a few times, but my answers were distant single words, my attention fixed entirely on the door. Michael appeared at the end of the afternoon. He did not bring flowers or magazines as usual. He came alone, his face set in a mask of professional concern that could not hide the irritation in the corners of his eyes. He entered the room with precise movements, like an executive walking into an important meeting. "Mother," he said, his voice restrained as if he were holding something very heavy inside. "I received your message." He did not use the word letter, as if naming it would give my words too much power. He sat in the chair beside the bed, but did not lean forward as he used to. He remained rigid, his shoulders tense, his hands firmly resting on his knees. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any speech. It was a silence loaded with years of unspoken things, of expectations that were never met, of love that had turned into obligation. I studied his face, searching for some trace of the boy I had raised, of the man he had been before responsibility hardened him. He finally spoke, his words measured and carefully chosen. "Why did you do this, Mother?" Why put all that on paper? His question was not about the content of the letter, but about the act of writing it. As if the problem were not what I had said, but the fact that I had said anything at all. The irony was so thick it could almost be touched. I was being questioned for breaking the silence that was slowly killing us. I tried to explain, but my words came out shaky, inadequate for the magnitude of what was at stake. I spoke about loneliness, about the need for a real connection, about the fear of becoming a burden. Each explanation sounded like an accusation to his ears. Every attempt at honesty was taken as an attack. He listened with a patience that hurt more than anger would have. His eyes scanned my face as I spoke, not searching for understanding, but for signs of emotional instability, of creeping senility, of anything that could invalidate my words and turn them into the delirium of a confused old woman. When I finished, he paused dramatically before answering. "Mother, you do not understand the pressure we are under. The bills, work, the children. It is not that we do not care about you. It is that it is complicated." The word complicated hung in the air between us like a curtain separating our worlds. For him, complicated meant logistics, costs, time. For me, complicated meant the widening gap between the love we felt and our ability to show it. Sarah arrived soon after, bringing with her the storm I knew was coming. Her face was red, her eyes swollen as if she had cried on the way to the hospital. She did not sit down, but stayed standing by Michael's side, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. "How could you, Mother?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. "How could you write those things? We thought you were happy with us." The question hit me with full force. Happy? How could anyone be happy knowing that her presence was felt as a weight? How could I find joy in visits that felt like obligations, in conversations that avoided all important subjects, in a relationship that had become transactional? I tried to explain again, but my words were swallowed by the emotional whirlwind that took over the room. Sarah spoke about sacrifices, about everything they had done for me, about how I did not appreciate their efforts. Michael tried to calm her down, but his intervention sounded more like damage control than genuine mediation. The confrontation went on for almost an hour, an endless cycle of accusations and defenses, of expressed hurts and wounded feelings. At a certain point, I realized that we were no longer discussing the letter or my stay in the hospital. We were arguing about 30 years of unspoken expectations, about family roles that no longer worked, about a love that had become too heavy to carry. When they finally left, promising to return the next day to solve this, I remained alone in the room, exhausted and shattered. The storm had passed, but the damage was done. The walls of our family, already cracked by time and circumstance, were now broken beyond repair. In that moment of absolute solitude, staring at the closed door through which my children had just left, Clara Santos understood that some truths, once revealed, cannot be hidden again, and that the price of authenticity is always higher than we imagine. In the eye of the family hurricane, I discovered that the truth I carried was only the tip of an iceberg of much deeper secrets. The days that followed the confrontation were filled with a deafening silence. My children did not return as they had promised. The phone remained mute, the hospital room empty of family visits. Even the nurses, sensing the tension that hovered in the air, became more reserved in their interactions with me, as if family conflict were contagious. The loneliness I had felt before now seemed like a luxury compared to the emptiness that settled in after the storm. Before, There was the hope of reconciliation, the possibility that misunderstandings might be cleared up. Now there was only the heavy silence of things said that could not be unsaid, of open wounds that had no idea how to heal. On the third morning after the confrontation, an unexpected visit broke the pattern of isolation. It was Elena, my daughter-in-law, but a different Elena from the one I knew. Her eyes were red from crying. Her hands trembled slightly as she put her purse down on the chair. "Clara," she began, her voice a hoarse whisper. "We need to talk." She did not wait for my answer. She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes avoiding mine for a long moment before finally finding the courage to face the reality that stood between us. What she told me in the hours that followed completely rewrote my understanding of the last years. The conversation I had overheard in the corridor was not about me, not really. It was about Michael and his gambling debts that threatened to destroy his family. It was about Sarah and her collapsing marriage, which she was desperately trying to save. It was about two adults drowning in their own problems, using my situation as an excuse to avoid facing their own realities. Every revelation was like a punch to the stomach. The weariness I had interpreted as rejection was in fact exhaustion from sleepless nights handling creditors. The impatience I had felt as a lack of love was the desperation of someone trying to keep up appearances while his world fell apart. Even the spaced-out visits I had blamed on my inconvenient aging were actually the result of crises I did not even know existed. Elena showed me documents, bank statements, letters from lawyers, threatening emails that Michael had hidden from everyone. She spoke about nights when Sarah came home with swollen eyes, inventing excuses about work when in reality she had been trying to save a marriage that had ended months before. The weight of those revelations was crushing. It no longer had to do with me being a burden. I was just one more piece in a puzzle of desperation that my children were trying to solve alone. The loneliness I had felt was not rejection, but protection, a misguided attempt to spare me worries they believed were too big for me to carry. When Elena finally left, promising to keep our conversation secret for the time being, I remained alone in the room with a new understanding that hurt more than the ignorance before it ever had. The truth had not set me free. It had shown me that I was trapped in a web of suffering far larger than I had imagined. The night that followed was the darkest of my life. Lying in the hospital bed, I reviewed every memory of the past years from this new perspective. The broken promises were not about negligence, but about survival. The avoided conversations were not about rejection, but about shame. The love I had doubted had not disappeared, it had been warped by pain and fear. In the middle of the night, something inside me broke. It was not a dramatic collapse with tears and screams, but a silent cave-in, like an inner wall falling under a weight it could no longer bear. I accepted that the family I had known was dead, not from lack of love, but from an excess of secrets. I accepted that my children were not the villains of my story, they were victims of their own poor choices, trying to navigate turbulent waters without knowing how to ask for help. In that acceptance, something strange happened. The anger I had felt began to fade, replaced by a deep sadness, but also by a clarity I had never had before. I realized that the problem had never truly been aging or dependency. The problem was that we had become strangers to one another, stuck in roles that no longer reflected who we were. When dawn came, it brought not hope, but resignation. Resignation that some things cannot be fixed, some bridges cannot be rebuilt, some truths arrive too late to change anything. But it also brought a fundamental understanding. I was not responsible for the choices of my adult children. I could not save them from themselves. I could only decide how I would respond to the storm they had created. In that moment, at the very bottom of our family despair, Clara Santos began to plan not reconciliation, but survival. Not the restoration of what had been lost, but the construction of something new from the ruins. Because sometimes, the only way to move forward is to accept that the past really is dead. From the ashes of the family I once knew, I began to build something new, not based on blood ties, but on shared truths. My hospital discharge came 1 week after Elena's revelations. The doctor signed the papers with his efficient pen, wishing me good luck with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The nurse handed me a bag with my belongings, the same clothes I had worn on the day of admission, now seeming to belong to another person, to a Clara who still believed in certain family illusions. Michael came to pick me up alone. His face carried a kind of exhaustion that went far beyond physical tiredness. He carried my small suitcase in silence, his movements mechanical like those of a robot programmed to fulfill obligations. In the car, the silence between us was dense, filled with everything that was not said, with all the truths we now knew but did not know how to touch. Instead of taking me to my home, he drove to his apartment. "It is better for you to stay with us for a few days," he said, his voice flat as if he were reading from a script. "Until you fully recover." The apartment was different from how I remembered it. There was a tense energy in the air, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Family photographs that used to decorate the walls were now stored in boxes. The children's toys, which once spread joyful chaos across the living room, were arranged with a precision that spoke of absence, not organization. In the days that followed, I watched my family with new eyes. I saw Michael wake before dawn to handle calls he took in a low voice behind a closed door. I saw Sarah come by to see the children with a forced smile that could not hide the pain in her eyes. I saw Elena trying to maintain an appearance of normality while her world crumbled around her. In the middle of that silent chaos, something began to change inside me. The anger and hurt gave way to a deep compassion, not for my children as my children, but for them as human beings fighting battles I had never imagined. I started small. Instead of demanding attention or care, I offered help. I made dinner when Elena was particularly overwhelmed. I read stories to my grandchildren when Sarah needed a moment to herself. I stayed quiet when Michael needed to talk about work, without judging, without giving unsolicited advice, simply listening. These small gestures opened cracks in the wall that separated us. One evening, Michael came home particularly defeated and, instead of locking himself in the office, sat in the kitchen where I was making tea. We did not talk about his debts or my abandonment in the hospital. We talked about the soccer team he had cheered for as a child, about our family vacations at the beach, about simple things that did not carry the weight of our current crises. It was a beginning. Small, fragile, but real. Sarah began to show up more often, not out of obligation, but because the apartment had become a refuge from the chaos of her own disintegrating home. She did not talk about her failing marriage, but she started asking me questions about my own life, about how I had handled difficulties when I was younger, about decisions I had made that turned out right or wrong. Elena, seeing these small reconnections, started sharing more openly the challenges they were facing. Not as dramatic confessions, but as conversations between adult women trying to navigate rough waters. She showed me budgets, asked my opinion on financial decisions, treated me not as an elderly woman to be looked after, but as an ally with life experience. Reconstruction was not about rebuilding the family we had before. That family was gone, destroyed by secrets and unmet expectations. Reconstruction was about creating something new from what was left, a relationship based not on predetermined family roles, but on authenticity and mutual respect. I began making small decisions for myself. I found a small apartment near them, not as rejection, but as a declaration of my need for independence. I went back to teaching sewing classes to women in the community, rediscovering skills I had abandoned when I became a full-time grandmother. I reconnected with friends I had neglected for years while focusing only on the family. Each step toward my own autonomy brought me paradoxically closer to them. Because now our interactions were not based on obligation, but on choice. They visited me because they wanted to, not because they were required to. I helped them because I could, not because it was my duty. During that process of personal reconstruction, something almost miraculous began to happen. The family that emerged from the rubble was stronger, more honest, more real than the one that had existed before. It was not perfect. There were still debts to pay, marriages to save or let go, wounds that needed time to heal. But at least we were now facing these things together, without illusions, without secrets, without the crushing weight of unrealistic expectations. Clara Santos did not recover the family she had lost. She built a new one from the ashes of the old. And she discovered that sometimes you have to lose everything in order to find something truly valuable. What began as the end of everything I knew revealed itself as the beginning of an authenticity I did not even know was possible. 6 months after leaving the hospital, I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, watching autumn paint the trees on the street in shades of gold and crimson. The air carried the sweet smell of dry leaves and the promise of the coming winter. On the table beside me were 4 cups of tea, one for me, one for Michael, one for Sarah, one for Elena. We had been meeting like this every Friday, not as a family obligation, but as a ritual we chose to keep. Michael arrived first, bringing fresh bread from a bakery he had discovered near his work. His shoulders no longer carried the invisible weight I had seen on him for so long. The debts had not magically vanished, but he had found a way to deal with them, honestly, with the help of a financial advisor and, surprisingly, with my non-judgmental support. "How are your sewing classes, Mother?" he asked, his smile genuinely warm for the first time in years. I told him about my new students, women of all ages who came not only to learn how to sew, but to find a space where they could simply be themselves, free from the expectations that adult life imposed on them. In many ways, my small sewing room had become what our family had never been, a place where people could be imperfect, vulnerable, real. Sarah arrived next, alone this time. Her divorce had been finalized the week before, and although there was pain in her eyes, there was also a sense of release, as if she had finally stopped trying to fit into a mold that was never made for her. "I brought photos of the children," she said, placing an album on the table. "They are adjusting better than I expected." We went through the pages together, laughing at the faces my grandchildren made for the camera, admiring their school drawings, celebrating their small achievements. The family that had emerged from the ashes was not the same as before, smaller in some ways, larger in others. But it was honest, and that honesty made every shared moment more precious. Elena was the last to arrive, bringing news about her new job. She had decided to go back to work after years as a homemaker, a decision Michael supported with a pride I had never seen in him. As we drank our tea and shared the week's news, I watched my family with a blend of admiration and gratitude. We were not perfect, far from it. There were still occasional tensions, disagreements, moments of frustration. But now, instead of burying these conflicts under a smooth surface of artificial normality, we faced them. We talked about them. We learned from them. The real legacy of that night in the hospital was not the pain of abandonment or the trauma of the overheard conversation. It was the understanding that families, like all living things, must evolve or die. The family we had before was based on rigid roles: the caregiving mother, the successful children, the perfect daughter-in-law. When those roles became unsustainable, the structure collapsed. The family we built afterward was based on something far more solid, on the acceptance of our imperfections, on respect for our individuality, on the courage to be vulnerable with one another. A few weeks after one of our Friday gatherings, I received an unexpected visit. It was Nurse Thompson, the same one who had cared for me during my hospital stay. She was no longer wearing her immaculate white uniform. She wore casual clothes, her face relaxed in an expression I had never seen on her before. "I came to apologize," she said, her voice gentle, without the professional stiffness from before. "And to say thank you." She explained that my time at the hospital, and especially the way I had handled my family's situation, had made her rethink her own approach to caring for the elderly. She had left the hospital and started working in a community program that focused not only on the physical health of older people, but on their emotional well-being and their family connections. "You showed me that sometimes the best treatment is not medical," she said, her eyes sincere. "It is human." Her visit was the perfect closing of a circle that had begun back in that hospital bed. The pain I had felt, the truths I had discovered, the battles I had fought, all of it had served a purpose greater than my own story. It had transformed not only my family, but had touched other lives in ways I never could have imagined. That night, as I watched the sunset from my balcony, I felt a deep peace that did not come from the absence of problems, but from the certainty that I now had the tools to face them. The Clara who had entered the hospital was different from the Clara who now looked at the horizon. The first lived in a reality built on comfortable illusions. The second lived in truth, however uncomfortable it might be at times. In that final moment of reflection, I understood that the greatest transformation had not been in my family or in my living situation. It had taken place inside me. I had learned that true love is not about dependency or obligation. It is about choice. It is about deciding, day after day, to remain connected even when it is hard, even when it hurts, even when it would take less effort simply to walk away. Clara Santos did not find a traditional happy ending. She found something far more valuable, an authentic beginning. And she discovered that sometimes you must lose everything you thought was important in order to find what truly matters.